Welcome to the University of Florida. First of all, my name is Agata Kowalewska, and I'm faculty in the Center for the European Studies. The UF Center is a Jean Monnet Center for Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. The center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and it is a multidisciplinary area and a language studies center. We have some housekeeping rules when at each of our events, and one of them is something that you may want to remember for this and the future events, that all our events are recorded and they will be published on the UFCS website, and you want to look for the YouTube channel. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and I would like all of you who have questions to submit them through the Q&A box. The next thing is that I need to introduce our presenter today, who will be talking about Baba Yaga. Our speaker is Dr. Andreas Jones, and Dr. Jones received his Ph.D. in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of California, Berkeley. He taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and in Santa Cruz campuses, and he also taught at the University of Washington in Seattle. His book, Baba Yaga, The Ambiguous Mother and Witch of the Russian Folklore, was published in 2004. And before I let Dr. Jones to tell us about Baba Yaga, I would like you to also remind you about the survey that you will receive at the end of our event. And I will encourage you to complete that survey, because thanks to it, we can improve the programming and have more of it. So now, Dr. Jones, please. And I will be sharing the slides.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you to Agata Kowalewska and the University of Florida for inviting me. And thank you everyone for attending and for your interest in Baba Yaga, who is sort of a witch-like character from the folklore traditions of the three East Slavic countries, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Just quickly, I think we have to acknowledge that if you have a connection to this part of the world or an interest in the history, culture of this part of the world, the present moment right now is really a very sad and distressing time. It's a little strange to sit here and talk about fairy tales and fairy tale characters when there's a war going on in Ukraine, people are dying and their homes are being destroyed. I don't have any answer to that other than to say that what we're looking at today is part of a cultural tradition that is much older than this war. It predates this war, the current regime in Russia, and it will outlive and outlast the regime, and it will outlive this war. So perhaps that's a small consolation. Anyway, so Baba Yaga is a character from folklore from these three countries, and she appears in a number of different forms of folklore. For example, in magic spells or incantations, if you wanted to make somebody fall in love with you, there are spells that call on Baba Yaga to do that. There are also spells to make a child stop crying and go to sleep that invoke Baba Yaga. And Baba Yaga was used by parents to frighten their children. You know, if you don't behave, if you're bad, Baba Yaga will come and get you. But what's interesting, children also have their own folklore, and you could say they kind of have responded to that. There are children's rhymes that sort of make fun of Baba Yaga, that express some hostility toward Baba Yaga. There's a Russian children's rhyme that addresses the rain, you know, like we say, rain, rain, go away. This is a children's rhyme that tells the rain, don't rain on me, go rain on Baba Yaga. So that's a few examples of different forms of folklore where Baba Yaga appears, but she's most often a fairy tale character. That's overwhelmingly, she most often appears in fairy tales. We think of fairy tales generally today as some stories that are entertaining. We read them out of books, and that they're entertainment for children. And historically, though, in the past, I think in Russia, Europe, and other places, fairy tales were entertainment both for children and for adults, and they weren't written down. They were part of oral tradition, they existed in oral performance. And often in Europe, Russia, and I think other places, the storytellers and their audiences were often people who didn't have access to education, people who did not know how to read and write. But the fact that somebody does not know how to read and write doesn't mean that they don't have a literature. They do. And this was something that you could say became very evident in the 19th century when educated people in Europe and Russia began to take an interest in the folklore of their countries and went out and started collecting it, writing things down. And what we found really is that there was a very rich literature indeed. It just had not been written down before that point. So it's good to remember that if you read fairy tales and books, that what you're reading is really a record of what originally was an oral performance. Another point is that, of course, if you read fairy tales in English translation from another language, you lose a lot gets lost in translation. The sound of the original language, rhyme, and rhythm, which are very important. So to sort of address that, I want to read a short excerpt from a Russian fairy tale in Russian and then English. This is a tale, if you're interested in fairy tales, you might recognize as the tale of Cupid and Psyche. It's a female-centered tale. The protagonist is a young woman with a supernatural spouse, or we might say her boyfriend is a supernatural being who disappears, and then she has to go search for him in a distant realm. In this Russian version of the story, there's a merchant with 3 daughters. He goes to town and asks his daughters what they want. The older 2 daughters want clothing or jewelry. The 3rd daughter says, "Bring me the feather of Phoenix, the bright falcon." So he does that, and then at night, Phoenix comes to visit her, and he changes his form from a falcon to a young man. He's actually a prince. Her sisters suspect that something is going on, and they put knives on the windowsill around the window. So when the falcon flies in, he gets injured, he bleeds, and he leaves her a message, which he says, "Если ты меня любишь, то ищи меня за 30 земель в 30 царстве." If you love me, search for me beyond thrice 10 lands in the thrice 10th kingdom. And so she sets out. Eventually, she finds her way to this other kingdom, but she wears out 3 pairs of iron boots, 3 iron walking sticks, and she eats 3 pieces of iron bread. So when she first sets out, this is the situation. This is the tale. Шла, шла, шла. Чоботы избила, пруть изломала, про свиру складала. Подходит к избушке, а избушка стоит на курьих ножках, повертывается. Избушка, избушка, стань к лесу задом, ко мне передом. Избушка повернулась. Вот она взошла в избушку, а там Баба Яга из угла в угол перевертывается. Одной губой пол стирает, а носом трубку закрывает. У ней нос Перевицкий мост. Фу, 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 говорит, бывало русского духу слыхом не слыхать, видом не видать. А нынче русский дух на ложку садится и в рот катится. Что, красная девица, делом пытаешь или дело летаешь? Бабушка, не столько дело летаю, сколько дело пытаю. Зачем же, говорит, сюда пришла? All right, and in English, it says, she walked, walked, and walked, wore out the boots, broke the stick, and swallowed the bread. She walked up to a hut, and the hut stood on chicken legs and turned around. Hut, hut, stand with your back to the forest, your front facing me. The hut turned, so she went into the hut, and there was Baba Yaga, turning around from one corner to the other. She was wiping the floor with one lip and closing up the chimney with her nose. Her nose was as big as the Perevitsky Bridge. Foo, 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 she said. It used to be that the Russian scent was neither heard of nor seen, and now the Russian scent sits down in a spoon and rolls into my mouth. Well, fair maiden, are you attempting a deed or are you flying from a deed? Grandmother, I'm not so much flying from a deed as I am attempting a deed. Why have you come here, she said. So that's the excerpt, and even in this short fairy tale excerpt, you get actually many of Baba Yaga's attributes. So we can have the next slide, please. And this is an illustration of her hut on chicken legs by a very talented artist, Ivan Bilibin. Generally the hut is on chicken legs. Sometimes the hut stands on chicken legs and ram's horns, which in Russian rhymes, na kurich noshkach, na baranich rojkach. Sometimes the hut stands on a spindle, which makes sense because sometimes when a girl comes to Baba Yaga's hut, Baba Yaga gives her a task of spinning, and it was an important form of women's work in the past, so that makes sense. Other features are that when the visitor comes into the hut, they notice that Baba Yaga she seems to have a very large body that takes up a lot of the space inside the hut. And she's described in sometimes very grotesque ways. She has a very large nose, as in this excerpt. Sometimes they say that her nose is sort of grown into the ceiling. Nos patologos. Sometimes she rakes the coals with her nose. Sometimes it's mentioned that she has very large breasts that hang over a rod. And she usually often smells the Russian scent, at least in the Russian tales. I think not in Ukrainian or Belarusian tales, but in the Russian tales, she smells the Russian scent. Sometimes Baba Yaga is referred to with an epithet, Baba Yaga Kastyanaya Naga, Baba Yaga, the bony leg. And what's interesting about the episode, the little excerpt I read, if you read many, many more of these, you find that it's very curious. The protagonist comes to Baba Yaga's hut. They say this magic phrase to make the hut turn around. They go in. There's a mention of Baba Yaga, her description of her, and then Baba Yaga smells the Russian scent, or she says the Russian bone has come. And then she either states or implies that she wants to eat her visitor. I'm going to eat you, or I want to eat you. And then what often happens, it didn't happen in the excerpt, but what often happens is that the hero or the protagonist reproaches Baba Yaga. And sometimes, especially if it's a young man, he'll use sort of rude language that we won't repeat here in the Zoom space. He'll say, you old this or that, why are you saying this? I'm tired, I'm hungry. You should give me something to eat or give me something to drink. So the protagonist reproaches Baba Yaga and she backs down right away. It's a very curious interaction. I'm not aware of anything like this in the fairy tale traditions of other countries or other traditions. Anything quite like that. So I think it's unique. Next slide, please. Another attribute that's frequent of Baba Yaga that you'll see in tales, this is another illustration by Ivan Bilibin, is that when you encounter her elsewhere, so you don't go to her hut, but she often appears riding in a mortar, pushing herself along with a pestle and sweeping away her traces with a broom. That's a common feature. I think there's some other things about Baba Yaga which might not be obvious right away on the surface, but as you read more tales, become more familiar with her, I think that there are things that come out. One is that, of course, Baba Yaga is a woman. Her name, Baba, means grandmother, old woman. So her name announces the fact that she's female. Storytellers mention her breasts sometimes. They also sometimes mention her genitalia. So she's obviously a woman, but at the same time, she often has masculine features. She sometimes speaks in a low voice or a bass voice or a very rough voice. We're going to see in a moment, there's a fairy tale where she wants to kidnap a boy and she wants to, by imitating his mother's voice. And at first she fails because her voice is too rough and she has to run to a smith and have her voice reforged to make it softer or finer so she'll sound like the boy's mother. Baba Yaga also engages sometimes in male-centered tales. She engages in hand-to-hand combat with a male protagonist. Sometimes she leads an army. So these are things that not traditionally women have not done at least in East Slavic area, at least not before World War II, or I think. Very masculine features, and those are explicitly masculine features. I think you might, if you were so inclined, you could see that there are also symbolic masculine or phallic features in Baba Yaga. The fact that she has a large nose, that she has an unusual leg, a bony leg. A few tales, she's one-legged. She's Baba Yaga Adnati Naga, Baba Yaga with one leg, or she has iron teeth. You could take that with a grain of salt, but I think it does make sense. Given that she has explicitly masculine features, she might also have implicit or symbolic masculine features. And what that does, I think her image overall, it makes her a bit androgynous. And I think the androgyny is something that contributes to her sort of eerie, uncanny nature, sort of her creepiness. But what you find also is that in many tales, she is about adult young male hero or heroine, a young adult, is that she mediates between men and women, either in a positive way or a negative way, by bringing men and women together or trying to keep them apart. So she plays a mediating role between men and women. And in that context, I think her androgyny really makes sense. And the other thing that I think is most interesting about Baba Yaga, which is also not obvious right away, but is something that you recognize after you start reading more and more tales where Baba Yaga appears, is that she's essentially an ambiguous character from the point of view of the protagonist of the fairy tale. Sometimes she helps the protagonist and sometimes she harms or tries to harm the protagonist. And if you just by number of tales, she's more often a villain than she's more often wicked than she is kind. I don't have an exact percentage, but the wicked Baba Yaga is more than 50% of the time, obviously. So this is interesting too, because this is something that I don't believe really happens in European fairy tales, where if you have a character with a name and a set of attributes, their behavior tends to be very predictable. They either, from the point of view of the protagonist, they're either helpful or they're wicked. But Baba Yaga does both. And I'm only at this point aware of two other fairy tale traditions where this happens. And these are both areas that are, you could say, next door to the East Slavs. And that is in Slovak fairy tales. There's a witch really with the same name, Ježi Baba, who also behaves ambiguously. And in Hungarian fairy tales, there's an iron-nosed witch, Vasaro Baba, who also behaves ambiguously. Okay, next slide, please. Oral tradition, one of the characteristics of folklore and oral tradition is that there are always variations and variability. And this is true with Baba Yaga's name as well. She's most often called Baba Yaga or Yaga Baba or just Yaga, but there are many other variations on the name Yaga, and some of them are listed here, and there are others as well. So there's, Yagibitsa, Yigidishna, Gigibicha, Igipufna, Agagnishna, many others. As you move west across Ukraine and towards Eastern Slovakia, the same or related witch has these other names, Inji Baba, Izhush Baba, Hinji Baba, Eji Baba. And then in Czech and Slovak folklore, there's a witch I already mentioned, Ježi Baba. One interesting thing is that Baba Yaga has children in various, sometimes she's the mother of dragons, sometimes she has human children, sometimes her children are frogs and snakes. When she has human children, sometimes her daughters have ordinary names, and sometimes they're called Yagishna, which means the daughter of Yaga. And sometimes she herself is called Yaga Yagishna, which is like Yaga, the daughter of Yaga. There are a few tales where she has a son who is called Agich or Yagich. This is really interesting, matronymic, in other words, a name that's derived from your mother. Because of this culture, the East Slavs, it's really a very patriarchal culture. And one sign of that is that everyone has a patronymic middle name. So if your father's name was Sergei, you might be Anna Sergeyevna or Ivan Sergeyevich. Your middle name says that you are the daughter or the son of Sergei. And here, though, is an example of a matronymic. It's the only time I think this happens in this sort of traditional East Slavic culture. And I think it's interesting this could only happen in a fantasy environment like the fairy tale. In the culture that's very patriarchal, here is a matronymic. And there's some other matronymics in the fairy tales. There are some characters, protagonists who are called Ivan the cow's son, or Ivan the maid's son, or Ivan the cat's son, Ivan Pushkin, Ivan Devich, Ivan Korovisin. And it's curious, this could only happen in a fantasy environment like the fairy tale. All right, next slide, please. Of course, there are questions of what does Baba Yaga's name mean and where does it come from? People have asked this. Of course, Baba in all the Slavic languages, the basic meaning is grandmother, old woman. The word Baba and other forms of that word have been applied to other things, so that to butterflies, stone formations, cakes, the constellation of the Pleiades. But the basic meaning is grandmother, old woman, and that's really what makes the most sense in interpreting this character. The name Yaga, it's not really clear what it might mean or where it come from. Linguists have looked at other words in Slavic languages that might be related to Yaga, or that these words and Yaga might come from the same root. In Old Church Slavonic, which is the first written Slavic language from the 9th century, there's the word yenza, which means disease or illness or affliction. And in some of the modern South Slavic languages, the word jeza means a horror, chill, or shudder in Croatian and Serbian. In Slovenian, it means anger. In some Bulgarian dialects, there's the word eza, enza, or janza, which means illness, or could have meant an evil spirit that brings illness. And here I'll say parenthetically, there's a scholar of Bulgarian language and Bulgarian folklore, Uta Dukova, who has suggested it as a possible origin. There are many theories about Baba Yaga's origin. This is one which I think seems to me as plausible as any, and that is she suggests that the figure of Baba Yaga originally would have been perhaps at a very distant time in the past, a common Slavic, when the Slavs all more or less spoke the same language, an evil spirit that brought illness, possibly a female spirit. And that among the Southern Slavs, the idea basically stayed the same, but gradually it just turned into these words are used as curses, but they lost the idea of a demon so much, and it just became a curse word. But whereas for the East Slavs and the West Slavs, gradually there's sort of a drift, and the the evil spirit or the name of the evil spirit moved from, there was a loss of the sense of danger of illness, and this name was applied to a character in folk narratives. And so in the West Slavic languages, you have a few examples. Jensa is a word for witch in Polish, and in Czech, Jezinka is a female forest spirit. And there are other words as well that you could mention. It's not really time. There are dialect words. In Russian, there's a dialect word yugach, which means to yell or make a noise, rage, curse, or to squabble. Also, there are linguists who've looked for parallels or perhaps words that are related to Yaga in other, for example, in Anglo-Saxon, in Old Norse, for words that mean doubt or worry or pain. And some linguists have suggested that the name Yaga, the word, is not really Slavic or Indo-European at all, that it was borrowed from other languages families. So it could have come from a Turkic language in Central Asia, from Mongolian, or perhaps from the languages of indigenous people in Siberia. And usually they find words for kinship terms, words that mean mother, elder sister, or aunt, that they suggest might have been the source of the name Yaga. So unfortunately, the linguistic evidence is a little bit, it's not really conclusive at this point. Next slide, please. The first documentation of Baba Yaga, the first written references to Baba Yaga come from the 18th century, including notes by a very important scholar and scientist, Mikhail Lomonosov, and other sources, written sources. Also, Baba Yaga appears in a kind of popular art form, a woodblock print called the Lubok. And there are two images here. And once again, as in so much about Baba Yaga, we don't know, it's not 100% clear the meaning of these images. The image on the left, Baba Yaga is riding a pig and going to fight with a figure called the crocodile, who is, part animal, part human. And on the right, you have Baba Yaga dancing with a bald-headed peasant who's playing a bagpipe. There's disagreement among historians what these images meant. Several, though, believe that these were sort of like political cartoons or a satire, and specifically directed against Peter the Great and his wife, the Empress Catherine. If that is the case, then what was true in the 18th century, actually it's still true today, which is that if you call somebody a Baba Yaga, compare them to Baba Yaga, it's not flattering, it's not meant as to be a flattering thing. And also in the 18th century, along with the very first references to Baba Yaga, people already were speculating about, where does Baba Yaga come from? What are her origins? And an idea was, they had the idea that she must be ancient, and that she probably came from the religion of the Slavs before they converted to Christianity. And of course, at that time, I think they thought, oh, the religion of the ancient Slavs, it must have been like the religion of ancient Greece. And they looked for parallels. And so they thought that maybe Baba Yaga was like the goddess of the underworld at that time. All right, next slide, please. In the 20th century, there's, you could say, important developments in the history of our efforts to understand the fairy tale and to understand Baba Yaga. And an important scholar whose name you should know, Vladimir Prop. He was a folklorist and a linguist. He was a professor at the University of Leningrad. And there are two works of his that are particularly of interest to us. One he wrote in the 1920s called The Morphology of the Folktale. He looked at a lot of Russian fairy tales, and many, many tales. And you've probably, if you read fairy tales, you've had this experience, especially if you read fairy tales that are roughly speaking in countries where Indo-European languages are spoken and beyond, in Europe, in Africa, large parts of Africa and Asia, is that you get the sense that the same things keep happening over and over again. A character someone is told, don't do this, and inevitably they do it, and there's some mishap occurs. So often fairy tales end with a wedding, that the protagonist marries, and usually a high status person. They marry a prince or princess. So Prop looked at this, and what he argues for in this book is that there's a single structure underlying all these fairy tales. And he describes the fairy tale in terms of the actions that happen, and he called them functions. And his conclusion is that there's a limited number of functions in fairy tales. Not every function occurs in every fairy tale, but they always occur in the same order. And he sort of tries to illustrate that in this book. Another point that he argues for is that all the different characters in these fairy tales can be described, or you can see them fitting into 7 roles. And of interest to us is the fact that the roles of the villain, self-obvious, and the donor, who is a character who gives the protagonist a magic object, or the equivalent of a magic object. And so what's interesting, of course, is Baba Yaga is both villain and donor. And Prop recognized this, and he comments on that in this book. Then in the 1940s, he continued his work on fairy tales, and he sort of asked the question of this. He discovered this, or identified this morphology, described this morphology. Well, where did it come from? What would explain it? And basing his work on, of course, scholars who had gone before him, anthropologists, ethnographers, literary historians, he argued that the fairy tale really came from ritual, and specifically from initiation ritual. So these are rituals when children move from child to adult status. And similarly, in the fairy tale, the protagonist goes to another realm, often has adventures, accomplishes difficult tasks, comes back to our world, and then marries. And so Propp argues that this is the historical roots of the fairy tale are really in initiation ritual. In this context, then, initiation ritual could be thought of as a symbolic death and rebirth. And so Propp argues this is what happens in the fairy tale. The protagonist goes to the land of the dead, has these adventures, and then returns to the land of the living. In that context, then, Baba Yaga is sort of she's on the border of the land of the living and the dead. Sort of her hut is on the kind of the gateway to the land of the dead. And so that's why if you come to her hut, you can't just walk in. You have to say a magic formula to make the hut turn around. And then Baba Yaga notices the Russian scent. And what's important is not so much that it's the Russian scent as it's the scent of the living, which is offensive to the dead. So Baba Yaga is associated with the dead. She has power over animals. And so Propp suggests that she actually was kind of a totem figure, like a totemic ancestor. And that initiation there might have been an idea in some initiation rituals that was like being swallowed by an animal. Baba Yaga's hut has retained its partially animal form, the chicken legs. Otherwise, further, he suggests that he recognizes that you have a good Baba Yaga, a nice Baba Yaga, and an evil Baba Yaga. And he suggests that what happened is that the good Baba Yaga is the older one, who belonged to sort of an early period, and then this older divinity was sort of reinterpreted with the coming of patriarchy, with the coming of agricultural society. Baba Yaga was reinterpreted, and you could say she was kind of demoted from being a goddess or a divinity and just to being, an evil witch. So these ideas, anyway, what I would say is that with all due respect to Professor Propp, I think there's some weaknesses in his arguments. In his work on the historical roots, he draws a great deal on ethnographic literature and he takes details from the East Slavic fairy tales and compares them to rituals and customs from peoples who are very far away, Aboriginal Australia or the Western Pacific or native North America, especially the Northwest Coast Indians. So the comparisons are really literally far-fetched, geographically very far-fetched, between peoples who, before modern times had no contact. I think another weakness is that not recognizing or not seeming to recognize that a great deal of what happens in fairy tales is fantasy and could be, creative imagination, and that not really every detail in a fairy tale has to have a historical source or be based on a historical fact or some past religion or some past custom. And I think also it ignores the role that storytellers and the audiences play in forming the fairy tale over time. There seems to be an assumption that the storytellers, people are just sort of passively transmitting something over time. Whereas I would say most folklorists today would argue that the tellers and audiences have played an important part in forming the fairy tale that we know today or that existed in the recent past. But in any case, whatever the weaknesses of Propp's argument are, his ideas have been very influential. And so especially in the Soviet Union and Russia, but other places. And I think many people look at Baba Yaga through this lens of ancient ritual and ancient religion. So anyway, move on. Next slide, please. As we mentioned before, with the names of Baba Yaga, there's a great deal of variation and variability. And the same is true of the fairy tale itself. Because of the oral tradition means that for something to survive in oral tradition, it has to be continually repeated, performed again, and remembered and transmitted from one generation to the next. And inevitably, especially fairy tales can be very long, they can be very complex. And so it's unlikely that somebody who's a good storyteller will ever perform the same fairy tale exactly the same way twice. So there's naturally variation. There's variation among different performers, and there's variation across regions and over time. So what this means is, I think from an academic perspective, if you want to study fairy tales and the characters in fairy tales and really have a good understanding or grasp of them, you can't just look at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 tales. You have to look at many to get a good overview of that character or of that tale. So in my own research on Baba Yaga, this is what I tried to do. I tried to gather as many tales as I could find that had been recorded from oral tradition. And I was especially interested in Baba Yaga's ambiguity, understanding that ambiguity, and especially interested in the question, is there any pattern? Is it just random? Baba Yaga's, the fact that she's donor and villain, is it random, or is there any kind of pattern to, is there method to the madness? Is there a pattern to her ambiguity? And I think there is a pattern. And I think you see this pattern if you look at the fairy tales in terms of the protagonist's identity, his or her gender and his or her age. And in the fairy tales, I think you can make a distinction between fairy tales about a child protagonist and a young adult protagonist. In fairy tales with the child protagonist, the child goes out into the world, has some adventure, returns home to their parents. Which is fewer fairy tales. What most fairy tales, it's a young adolescent who goes out of the world, has some adventures, accomplishes difficult tasks, and ultimately marries a high status person usually. So you have four categories then: adult, male child, adult male, adult female. And if you look at the different Baba Yagas that show up in these four categories, there's some interesting things. But first, let's look at here's the fairy tale that is the most popular in East Slavic tradition about a boy and Baba Yaga. And this is folklorists have devised a classification system to study fairy tales, and they've given them all numbers. This is fairy tale is type 327. And it's basically the basic story is that Baba Yaga kidnaps a boy, takes him to her hut, and tries to cook him in her oven. And for most of us, if we hear that, you'll think of the Grimm's fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, which is a subtype, belongs to this 327, but is a different subtype. And an interesting thing, there are in East Slavic fairy tales, there are some examples of this subtype where it's a boy and a girl go to the witch's house, and the witch tries to cook the boy or even both of them, and they escape. There's a few examples of that, but overwhelmingly in East Slavic fairy tales, this fairy tale is really just about a boy and Baba Yaga. It's a boy alone who encounters Baba Yaga. There are lots of wonderful variations. Unfortunately, we don't have time. I'd love to spend all day going over this wonderful variations and very interesting things that happen in this fairy tale. But basically, there's a boy, his parents leave during the day, and they warn him, don't go outside. Baba Yaga will come, but don't go outside. Or if Baba Yaga comes in and starts going through the spoons in the kitchen, don't say anything. But of course he does that, and he is kidnapped. There's another kidnap scenario where the boy is a little bit older. He's fishing, he's out in a boat or canoe fishing on a lake or river. And Baba Yaga comes to the shore, and she tries to lure him to the shore by imitating his mother's voice and saying, Ivashka, or whatever the boy's name is, I have food. She has food for him. Usually it's porridge, kasha. I have this, food kasha with butter. Why don't you come? And at first he's not fooled because her voice is really rough. He recognizes that it's not his mother. So Baba Yaga runs to the smith, has her voice reforged, and then she's able to fool him, trick him, and kidnap him. Next slide, please. Then she brings the boy to her hut, and she tries to cook him, or she first tells this is an image from a cartoon, an animated film, and they've altered the story. In oral tradition, it's never a bird that does this. I don't know why maybe they thought it would look less gruesome or frightening if it was a bird rather than a human figure. But in the oral fairy tales, what happens is that Baba Yaga tells one of her daughters, before she goes out during the day, she says, okay, cook the boy in the oven. And so the girl tells the boy to sit down on the baker's peel, which is this implement like a large flat shovel or spatula. It's what you use for putting pizzas into the oven or taking pizzas out of an oven. She says to the boy, sit down on the peel. And so the boy sticks his arms and legs out, and so he won't fit into the oven. Or he says, oh, I don't know how. Why don't you show me how? So very foolishly, Baba Yaga's daughter sits on the peel. He shoves her into the oven, slams the door shut, and she gets cooked. And then the boy waits, and then when the meat is cooked, he takes the meat out of the oven, puts it on the table, and then hides. Baba Yaga comes home. She sees the meat, eats the meat. It's very gruesome. She eats her own daughter, really. And this is you can find some interesting parallels in Greek mythology for this. She eats her own child. And then she sort of laughs to herself and says, I'm going to roll around on Ivashka's bones, or whatever the boy's name is. I'm going to roll around on his bones. And the boy he's hiding somewhere in a corner, and he taunts Baba Yaga. And he says, roll around on your daughter's bones. And then she realizes what has happened. She's very angry. And then the next day she tells her second daughter to cook the boy, but the same thing happens. And then the third day she tries to cook the boy herself, and the same thing happens. Or the boy shoves Baba Yaga into the oven. She manages to get out and she chases the boy. Sometimes he climbs up a tree, and then Baba Yaga starts to gnaw at the tree with her teeth. And after a while, she wears her teeth out and she has to run to the smith and get another set of iron teeth. She comes back and gnaws at the tree some more, and then, but just in time, some geese fly by and they rescue the boy and take him home. So that's there's a happy ending. It's a gruesome tale, but for the boy, there's a happy ending. Okay, next slide, please. So that was the most popular, you could say, I think, just based on how often it was told or recorded, based on the written tales that we have. That appears to have been the most popular story that people told about Baba Yaga and a boy. In female-centered tales, the most popular tale about Baba Yaga and a girl was another very widespread fairy tale in the world. It has the number 480. Folklorists have assigned it this number. And overall, it's the international folk convention to refer to this as the tale of the kind and the unkind girls. And also there are many variations on this, and there's not time to go into them. Also very interesting variations. Sort of the most essential, the story is that there's a family situation of a mother, a father, and a daughter. The mother dies, the father remarries, so there's a wicked stepmother, and she has her own daughter. And at some point, the stepmother tells her husband, take your daughter and leave her in the forest, or she just sends the girl away, go to my aunt Baba Yaga and get some needle and thread, or she just sends her away. And then in any case, the girl goes out, and at some point she encounters a supernatural figure. The supernatural figure tests her in some way, asks her questions, or gives her tasks to accomplish. And the girl answers the questions the right way. She accomplishes the tasks, and the supernatural tester rewards her, gives her money or clothing or some other gifts. And then the girl returns home, or her father comes and picks her up. And the stepmother sees these things, and she wants her own daughter to get the same good things. So she sends her own daughter out, but her own daughter is the unkind girl. She is rude to everyone. She is rude to the supernatural tester, or she does not accomplish the tasks, and she is punished or killed. And so that's often how the tale ends. And sometimes when the stepmother finds out what has happened, she dies of shock. And so you could say at the end, it's wish fulfillment for the kind girl. She's gotten rid of her wicked stepmother and her stepsister. She's removed them. In the Russian, there are many variations on this in the East Slavic tales. Sometimes the wicked stepmother is Baba Yaga. And in those tales, often when the girl goes out, the supernatural figure she encounters is a male character called Moroz or Morozka, who is the personification of frost. And there's a moment in this tale which I think is also very gruesome. I find it as gruesome as Baba Yaga, cooking and eating her own children. Frost comes and he starts freezing the girl to death. And he says, "Oh, are you cold?" And the girl says, "Oh no, I'm warm, I'm fine." And I find this really gruesome, but I think it's a very telling moment, I think, in this fairy tale, because I think there's a message being transmitted here. And I think it's a message that not just here, but I think many traditional cultures all over the world transmit to girls and young women at some point. And the message is basically, you're going to have to endure things that are difficult, uncomfortable, unpleasant, frightening, painful, but don't complain. We don't want to hear you complain. I think that's a message that's being transmitted maybe in this fairy tale. So in some tales, the tester, the supernatural tester, is Frost, the personification of Frost. Sometimes the tester is a bear, that's the image on the right. And often the tester is Baba Yaga. The girl comes to Baba Yaga's hut, and Baba Yaga gives her various tasks to do, such as she tells the girl, and then she says, "Oh, I want you to do this, and if you don't, I'll eat you." So she tells the girl, "Go and get water and heat up the bath for me." And she gives her a sieve. So the girl has to carry water in a sieve. And sometimes a bird helps her, a bird will tell her, to put clay on the sieve, or the bird will put clay on the sieve, and then the girl is able to carry water. Or Baba Yaga gives the girl a large amount of wool and says, okay, you need to spin this wool overnight. And the girl has cooked some porridge, and their mice come and she feeds the mice, and the mice help her spin the wool, all the wool overnight, and she finishes that task. Baba Yaga says, oh, I want you to bathe my children, and the children are frogs and snakes and toads, so animals you might not necessarily want to handle. There are also tales where Baba Yaga says, oh, I wants to play blind man's buff with the girl. So Baba Yaga covers her eyes, takes a big stick. She gives the girl a bell and says, okay, run around the hut and I'll try to catch you. And so there's a mouse takes the bell and runs around. So Baba Yaga ends up running after the mouse, but not catching the mouse, and also not hitting the girl. And finally she gives up. And then so in the end, Baba Yaga rewards the girl, and then who goes home. And then of course the episode is repeated with the unkind girl who does not feed the animals. She's unkind to or says rude things to Frost, Maros, and then who's punished or killed. And so that's how that tale ends. So those are the two tales that are the most frequent for Baba Yaga and a boy, Baba Yaga and a girl. So next slide, please. And then something very interesting now, as you move to fairy tales with a young adult protagonist, a young woman, a young man, what you find is that actually there's a shift here for male-centered tales. In the stories about a boy protagonist, Baba Yaga is always a villain, story that I've described, and there's some other fairy tales as well. She's always a villain. But when you move to tales about a young adult male, Baba Yaga is often a villain, but she is sometimes a donor. For example, the image on the right is from a very nice fairy tale called the Frog Princess, Tsarevna Lyubushka. And in all the versions I found of this tale, so perhaps in most, where Baba Yaga appears, she's always a donor. So Baba Yaga is often a villain. She often is, does very, wants to kill the protagonist, or she turns people to stone, or, gouges out their eyes. But in male-centered tales, adult tales, she is sometimes a donor. So for the boy, she's only a villain. For the young adult male, she moves to being overall ambiguous. So often a villain, but sometimes a donor. So there's a shift in the profile of Baba Yaga for boys and for young men. In that there's a shift you can find. In female-centered tales, it's interesting because what you saw in the Tale of the Kind and the Unkind Girls is that Baba Yaga is essentially ambiguous. Sometimes she's the wicked stepmother. Sometimes she's the supernatural tester, who is often very hostile and threatening. It's interesting. There's some tales where the storyteller says the girl accomplishes the task, and Baba Yaga, she was surprised. She didn't expect the girl to be able to do this, or she didn't want the girl to be able to carry the water in the sieve, or do whatever it was. So that there's a hostile intention. She really wanted to be able to kill the girl or eat her, but she recognized, okay, she rewards the girl anyway. So she's a donor, but you could say a hostile and unwilling donor. So for the girl-centered tales, Baba Yaga is an ambiguous character, not entirely a villain, but you couldn't say she's entirely a villain as she is for the boy. She's essentially ambiguous. And when you move into the tales about a young adult female, it remains true. She's still ambiguous. She's sometimes a donor and sometimes a villain. In the excerpt that I read earlier, the tale about Phineas the Bright Falcon, in that particular tale, actually the heroine comes then to 3 Baba Yaga cousins, and they all give her, what happens, they give her magic objects of silver and gold. She comes to the other realm where another princess has married the falcon, and sort of has him under enchantment, sort of. And the girl, basically she has these golden objects. She trades them for 3 nights with Phineas, and then on the 3rd night, she's able to wake him up, and he recognizes what's happened, and they're reunited, and there's a happy ending. So there is a qualitative difference in the profile of Baba Yaga for boys and young men versus for girls and young women. And I think this is, to me, this suggests that overall, Baba Yaga is an ambiguous figure, and that she has something to do with the mother-child relationship. Her role in these tales is a reflection in some way, obviously very exaggerated, fantastic, marvelous imagery, but it reflects somehow the mother-child relationship, maybe not as it really exists, but maybe as this culture imagines it, or has anxieties about it, about the boy-mother relationship, about the girl-mother relationship. This is we're running out of time. I've got to try to bring this to a conclusion. There's a big question, which is, what do fairy tales mean? That's a big, big question. There's a lot of debate, lots of discussion, many books. I just refer you to a vast literature there. Some folklorists have suggested that, and there are many meanings. I mean, the fairy tales are very evocative. They're beautiful stories. We, I think, have a strong aesthetic response to them, and we have an emotional response. And I think part of the reason for the emotional response, and this is some folklorists have suggested that, one of the meanings of the fairy tales is that they deal with essential conflicts and tensions in society, and essential family conflicts between the generations, between parents and children, between siblings, between men and women, or perhaps between the individual and the group, the individual who has wishes for autonomy and our collective, which says, no, you can't just do everything you want. I think the fairy tales also I saw this form pattern of initiation, I think was not necessarily historically related to initiation ritual, but one thing that the fairy tales are about is the process of maturation, of being a child and moving out into the world, and finding your identity as a young woman or as a young man, obviously expressed in this very fantastic, colorful imagery of the fairy tale. And I think that would explain why fairy tales have been so popular and why they have survived for so long in oral tradition and have spread so widely across many continents. And I think in this complex form, you have a character like Baba Yaga. An ambiguous mother figure in a lot of ways is like a mother with a negative sign. Mothers are supposed to nourish their children. Baba Yaga wants to eat children. So, but it's not entirely a wicked witch, which is interesting, and that's also a difference between East Slavic and other traditions or European fairy tale traditions. So anyway, I have to end it there. We're running out of time. But this is a complex character. I think no one is ever really going to have the final word about, our friend Baba Yaga. So thank you for listening, and we'll end there. And I guess we'll see if there are any questions.
Oh, something I forget often to unmute myself. So there are questions, and since you already mentioned that there are multiple resources, there's actually one question about resources, and could you recommend something in the Old Church Slavic?
Oh, in Old Church Slavonic? No, I don't have. I mean, you can go online. There are resources online, and the word. I mean, if you Google this term, you will find it online. Yeza and Yenza. I mean, I studied a little bit of Old Church Slavonic as a graduate student, and it's a difficult language to, even if you say you've studied Russian or Polish, or you know a modern Slavic language, Old Church Slavonic is not so easy. But there's certainly there are textbooks and yes, and resources online.
Yeah, and another question about resources is about Baba Yaga.
Well, let's see, I did prepare materials for you. I don't know if you're going to put them online.
We may. I mean,
okay, yes.
If they're ready, then we will definitely post them together and sort of information to all our listeners is that when you're looking for resources that are part of this webinar series, look under the folder for the community on the center website. We will post everything there. There are questions starting with the beginning when you were talking about Baba Yaga being female with some masculine attributes. And the question is, do you suspect that the more ogre-like stories were created after the rise of Christianity?
What was created after?
The ogre-like stories.
Oh, okay. Well, that's been suggested by many people. Vladimir Prop, among others, that there was a kind Baba Yaga, and then the evil witch is a later, I'm saying not Plastovania, it was a later layer that was added to her. I don't have anything new to add. There's a lot of debate and questioning about her history or the history of Baba Yaga before the fairy tales that we know, beginning in the 18th century. I really don't have anything new to add to the debate about history. I think we don't. I would say a careful researcher, skeptical researcher. I think we don't really know anything before the first recording, which is the 18th century. I think there's good evidence. You could say tangential evidence that would push her back to the Middle Ages. And that's not from Slavic traditions, but actually from the folklore of the German-speaking people in the Alpine regions. There's a character who is a witch character who's a little bit like Baba Yaga. She's not a character in fairy tales. It's called Perchta. and is a character of people that people believed in. There were legends about Perchta, like ghost stories that people had been carried away by Perchta, or there were beliefs that she was associated with spinning. She would reward or punish girls or young women if they didn't spin well, or they were lazy. She would punish them, or they weren't supposed to spin on certain days. She would punish them for that. She was supposed to appear around Epiphany, January 5th and 6th. Anyway, so a figure similar to Baba Yaga. She had an iron nose also, but she is mentioned in documents from the 13th and 14th centuries. So there you have a character similar to Baba Yaga, geographically not too far away. You could say almost a neighboring people with similar folklore traditions in many ways, and who is documented from the Middle Ages. So I think there's a good evidence, so indirect evidence, not from the Slavic tradition, but from another tradition that would I think it's reasonable to assume Baba Yaga is as old as Perchta. So she probably dates back to the Middle Ages. Whether she was again, one theory is that, yes, she was a positive goddess who became evil. This linguist Ute Dukova I mentioned suggests that she may have derived from an evil spirit of illness in Slavic belief. They're both possible. I think we just don't know. I'm a skeptic in that. I don't think we will ever know where Baba Yaga comes from. However, what I would say is that in the fairy tale tradition that we do know, that was finally written down and in the beginning in the 18th century and really in earnest in the 19th century, she was an ambiguous character for that tradition. That's how I really looked at her. And that in spite of these differences are part of her overall image. And we just have to deal with it. It's complicated. It's very complicated because, and in some tales, in one and the same tale, somebody comes to three Baba Yaga sisters. The first two Baba Yaga help the protagonist, and they say, "Oh, watch out for the third Baba Yaga. She's really mean," and then the third Baba Yaga is a villain. So I think in people's minds and in the tradition, she really was an ambiguous character. So my answer is that I don't know if I don't have an answer. I don't have anything new to add to that debate.
Okay, so talking about older tradition and newer tradition, there's a question here: if there are any newer trends that you support in the Baba Yaga lore. So you're talking about 13th, 14th century. So is there anything that was added more recently to the Baba Yaga character?
Well, again, we don't know what her character was back in the Middle Ages. There's no record, so we don't know. We really only know from the period that we have, which is, I guess, about 200 years of folktale recording. I would say the image is fairly stable. Of course, I only looked at oral tradition. So it was people, folklorists, collectors who went wherever it was in the city, or they went out into the countryside, different parts of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and wrote down these tales. Of course, since then, there have been, of course, she's a fascinating character, and it's wonderful images, the hut on chicken legs, the mortar and pestle. And so people have done other things with her. Of course, they've made, as you saw, in the Soviet Union, they made animated films, cartoons about Baba Yaga. People have written other stories about her, and of course have made changes. But I think in oral tradition, I don't think so much changed. I think the image was it's a conservative oral tradition, and I think the imagery remains stable for that period of the recordings.
There is a very particular question about Baba Yaga and her nose. And somebody said that they heard that nose comes from associating Baba Yaga with geese. And her nose is the representation of a beak. And any comment on Baba Yaga and geese?
Yeah, that's been suggested. There's actually one scholar, you can find among the resources that you'll have. My work on Baba Yaga is published, and I summarized a lot of the scholarship in that book. If you're curious, there was one scholar who found that in some dialects the word Baba means pelican, and he sort of connected Baba Yaga with a pelican. So I don't really believe that myself. That she could have an association with birds. Many people have suggested that as well. She's been associated with birds, with snakes. And I think that's very likely, possibly, it's possible there's a connection. Also, I would just caution, though, if you study folklore, is that both those animals, birds and snakes, I would say that they're very they're symbol generating animals in all cultures. There's a lot of symbolism connected with birds and snakes, so that somebody would see a connection. It's very easy to, it's not hard to make that connection. Whether there's really a historical connection, I don't know. I mean, the psychoanalytic school would say this is, a phallic symbol, and it makes her into sort of a masculine woman, which I think, anyway, you can, all these theories, the problem is we can't verify any of this. I would say choose the theory you like. You can choose whichever theory you like. Unfortunately, we can't verify so many of these things.
Yes, that's true. But you mentioned the female masculinity, and there is actually a question about that Baba Yaga was connected to that, between being a female with some masculine characteristics, and there is a transition from more gentle character to more hostile one. So those two concepts, do they connect? The Baba Yaga being more masculine and being more hostile versus being more feminine and being more gentle?
I think what you find is, there's a few things I would say. I think her, even when she is kind to a hero, in the stories where she's a donor, the tales, very often the protagonist comes to her hut, even when she's a donor, she threatens to eat them. She hints, I want to eat you. And then, of course, she backs down, and then she is a donor. So even when she is a donor, she can be very hostile and very threatening. I would say, I think that, the question of masculinity versus femininity, I think it's fairly consistent. I don't see necessarily a change in the image between her androgyny. I think you could find it in tales where she's a donor and in tales where she is a villain.
Okay, so the question that sort of follows about it, is there any male Baba Yaga? So somebody who is her counterpart?
Well, occasionally, I think, actually, I don't recall this. She has a husband when she marries a human husband, when she's the wicked stepmother. There might have been one tale, if I'm recalling, where she has a husband. In the Slovak fairy tales, I remember the Ježi Baba does have a husband who's called Ježi Babe in one fairy tale, although it's exceptional. She has, there's a counterpart. She appears, and there are a number of fairy tales where she and the ogre Cachet both appear. For example, a tale where the hero, it's a male hero. He has a supernatural spouse. She disappears. She is being held by Cachet, and the only way he can rescue her, he needs a horse that is faster than Cachet's horse. And Baba Yaga has the horse, and he has to herd her. She has a herd of mares, of horses. The mares are actually her daughters, and he has to herd those horses for 3 days and not let them run away. And of course, Baba Yaga tells her daughters, run away. She wants him to fail, but he manages to do it. And then at the end of the 3 days, he can choose whichever horse he wants, and he knows which horse to choose, and that is the horse. He's able to rescue his wife from Cachet. So I think people have pointed out that in a way they're kind of a pair, Baba Yaga and Cachet.
Something that relates to this, where you were talking about Baba Yaga as a fairy creature or fairy tale creature. What about Baba Yaga as a more mythical creature, where she is more of the goddess than wicked human being almost?
Well, I think she's most often a character in fairy tales, and I think the fairy tale, keep in mind that I think the fairy tale is what I'd say, it's a very defined, a strong genre. So when a character is drawn into fairy tales, I think they have to, Prop identified this, there's a structure to the fairy tale. It's very definite. And also, if you look in most traditions, and this is true in East Slavic as well, the world of the fairy tale is very defined. When you begin the fairy tale, there formulate phrases. We say, once upon a time. So once you hear that, okay, I'm sort of in the world of the fairy tale. And then often at the end, in English, we just say, oh, they lived happily ever after. In Slavic fairy tales, there are many different formula phrases. Often they're sort of humorous, they rhyme, and they kind of sort of quickly pull you out of that world again. And now we're back in the real world. So I think the fairy tale is very much a world of its own. Baba Yaga does appear in other genres that I mentioned that have to do with, their spells, charms, which suggests, there's another big question is, did people believe that these stories were true? And there's not a single answer to that. Sometimes the folklore collectors would ask the storytellers, are these stories true? Did they happen? And people said different things. Some people said, oh, of course they were true. You know, why would the old people lie to us? You know, the old people who told us these stories, you know, why would they have told us a lie? You know, or other people said, oh, yes, in the past, you know, there used to be dragons. These things all happened. And then, of course, other storytellers clearly recognized that this was sort of entertaining fiction. Also, one of the formulas that they used to end a tale, in Russian at least, they would say, you know, вот и сказка вся, больше врать нельзя. That's the whole tale. I can't lie anymore. In other words, everything I just told you was just this, you know, an entertaining kind of a lie. I lied to you. This was an entertaining lie. So that's the fairy tale. But Baba Yaga does appear in, for example, in these spells and incantations. There just recently published, there's a book on witchcraft in Russia and Ukraine. And there was in the 18th century a witchcraft trial or an investigation. I guess it was by probably the church authorities. And a man somewhere in a village, they found he'd had a spell written down, and he wanted a woman to fall in love with him. And the spell called on Satan, the devil, and then Baba Yaga or Yaga Baba to come and make this woman, you know, fall in love with me and just pine away for me. And so I think people certainly believed in the devil. They believed the devil was real. And so if you have a spell with the devil and then Baba Yaga, probably they believed that Baba Yaga was also very real. So I think there was, in a way, she was a character that is similar to, there were also, of course, people believed in spirits of nature, like the forest spirit, Yeshi, or Vadyanoi, the waters, when people drowned, they said, oh, the Vadyanoi drowned this person, if somebody drowned while swimming. There were spirits of nature who were often hostile, and Baba Yaga is similar to them in some ways, and I think she kind of shades into them. So I think in spells, people seem to believe that she existed. Other customs, in one part of Russia, there was actually a custom that had to do with the harvest. People would sing a song that invoked Baba Yaga at the end of the harvest, asking her not to sort of steal the grain. So I would say, as far as a mythical creature, I think that's where you would find that. But those are exceptional. She's most often a fairy tale creature. If I would hazard a guess about her history, again, I think that the theory put forward by Uta Dukova about an evil spirit of illness might have been the origin, or an evil spirit being the origin of Baba Yaga. It's possible that that was the case, and that for the East Slavs, this character gradually drifted away from being an evil spirit to being a character in narratives. But maybe in few genres like the incantation or this harvest custom, there was sort of still a survival of her previous life as an evil spirit. That's a possibility, but again, I'm a skeptical scholar, and before the first written records, it's speculation.
Unfortunately, our hour has ended. We are out of time, and I understand that there are many more questions, and apologies for everyone who didn't have that particular question answered. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Dr. Jones, for being here with us and talking about Baba Yaga. And for those who did not have their questions answered, I want you also to refer you to resources that will be published on the center website. One of them will be a recording of our webinar. The other one are also prepared by Dr. Jones about Baba Yaga. When you're looking at the center website, look for the community folder. All the resources will be there. And unfortunately, we'll have to say goodbye today, but I'm inviting everybody to our third seminar in the series, and or webinar. That webinar will be exactly a month from today. It will be March 7th. We'll meet with Mr. Witold Vargas, and he will be talking about the other fairy tales, not just Baba Yaga and how special she is, but also about creatures that were encountered in the water, in the woods, around the house, and were they really good souls, or maybe mischievous, or maybe just bad. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you to all of you. And please come back, visit us on March 7th. Bye-bye now.